Okay, let me just welcome back Mr. Ian R. Craig. Thank you very much.
Morning.
Try this microphone. Is this okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Okay, so let's take a little look at Ireland. Now, I could spend best part of the next hour sort of walking you through the detail of how and where Ireland owes all its money. The total that Ireland owes mainly other European governments, because it works like the fractional reserve illustration that I showed you. Everybody lends everybody else money, then they multiply it on a fractional reserve basis and then lend it out again. Until such time as eventually the economy effectively collapses and can't underpin the total amount of the loan, can't pay the interest. The number for Ireland is $865 billion. What was the bailout amount? 85 billion. Now, notice a relationship between the two numbers? Okay, so you get a bailout of 85 billion. That goes into the bank. They apply the fractional reserve rate, and that's how you address the total debt of 865 billion. In reality, the interest that is owed is not on the bailout sum. Don't worry about it, guys. I'm going to come back later. The interest that's owed is not on the bailout sum. The interest that's owed is on the total loan. So they're not exactly lying when they say that the bailout amount is $85 billion, but they're not exactly telling the whole story either. And that's exactly what occurred here. And that's why it was that the people in Brussels were high-fiving, because they said, you know, these guys, they haven't seen what we're doing. You know, they've fallen for the smoke and mirrors. They've had their eye on this hand while we've been manipulating it back here. I got to come to some questions later. I have to come to questions later, so otherwise we'll never finish my presentation.
It's a loan we got, 85. It's not a bailout.
Yeah, well, of course, a bailout means a loan. You know, it's a loan. Because without that loan, the economy just can't continue. But of course, the reality is that's exactly what happened in Iceland. And sure, it causes short-term pain and grief, whilst you're working through the creativity that's required to put together an alternative plan of action other than the one proposed by the World Bank and the IMF. And that's why, 2 years on, Iceland is well on the road to recovery. The next part of the problem to hit in the Irish economy is the mortgage crisis. Morgan Kelly of University College Dublin has stated that 800,000 people this year in 2011 are at risk of losing the roof over their head in Ireland because the families cannot pay the interest on their mortgage. In Iceland, nobody has been thrown out of their home for 2 years. And that has just been extended for 5 months. And the Icelandic government said nobody should live in fear of losing their home because of the manipulated financial crisis. And they've implemented a program which actually translates as debt forgiveness, but it's not really a true description. What they've done is they've said, look, what we're proposing to do is the financial crisis was created by the bankers and their globalist masters. It is not the fault of the Icelandic people. If they bought a house at £1 million with a mortgage at 80% of that, if the property is falling, let's say it's halved to £500,000, their mortgage liability remains at 80% of the adjusted value. Now, they're not looking to get a free ride out of this, because what they're saying is over time, as the economy recovers, and if the house prices go back up, then the mortgage liability will go back up on the same percentage, up to a maximum liability of what they first borrowed. Now, this is incredibly creative. Now, it's causing some problems in the global money markets because it's impacting on a lot of the pension funds. And that's why there's potentially, after the mortgage crisis, the next crisis is pensions, particularly corporate pensions, but also state pensions. Because you've got to remember that part of the arrangement for the Irish bailout was that the 14 billion fund for state pensions had to be thrown back into the melting pot. So there is potentially here a problem on pensions. And especially as Brian Lenihan stated that he anticipated 100,000 people young people leaving the country this year. And it won't be the people that Ireland can afford to lose. Of course, it will be the people trained as doctors, nurses, technicians, plumbers, electricians, carpenters. I mean, all the trades, potentially the wealth-generating trades. But they'll be the people. Oh, put it up. They'll be the people who take their transferable skills to Australia, to Canada, to New Zealand, or wherever. And what's happening, of course, is what Ireland is losing is the generation of people who are effectively relied upon to fund the pensions of their retirees, who probably won't be leaving the country. So it's a real mess. Now, as Therese said, the Irish territory isn't just the landmass that's above water. In fact, this is the Irish territory. Here's the little piece that's the country, and here's Irish territory. Okay? It's massive. Absolutely massive. Irish territorial waters account for 23% of all European fishing. All European fishing. But sadly, that was sold to the European Union for €6 billion. 6 billion euro. Somebody was either seriously drunk when they signed this deal, or this is malfeasance. This is total mismanagement of national resources. Probably brought about by serious pressure in the guise of economic hitmen. So Ireland right now is permitted to fish just 4% of the total EU fishing quota. So actually, forget the oil and gas for a moment. Forget the oil and gas. If Ireland was retaining any vestige of national sovereignty, it could actually have avoided this current mess just through its fishing resources. But they were sold for $6 billion, which supposedly was going to be reinvested into farming and agriculture, but that didn't really happen, did it? So the pressure is put on when interest can't be repaid to sell off other assets. And all throughout Europe right now, all those countries that are in difficulty repaying the interest, they are being told to sell off their national assets. And it shouldn't be any surprise that both Ireland and the UK announced the intention to sell off their national forests on the same day last year. Same day. No accident. It was part of the agenda, part of the strategy. Let's take a look at some of the details on the oil and gas, because this is the crime of the century. I mean, in fact, there are so many crimes that have been committed here. Actually, it makes Ray Burke look like a hero. I don't mean that, actually, at all. Look at the Corrib gas field. Sitting just 80 kilometres off the coast of County Mayo. More than half a trillion cubic feet of national gas. Now, let me tell you that in the oil industry, reserves are always underestimated. First of all, reserves are calculated based on current technology. Now, let me tell you that the oil and gas industry spends more on R&D than almost any other industry, with the exception of the pharmaceutical industry. So, in other words, the opportunity to recover increasing amounts of the deposits are occurring all the time. That's why fields that supposedly were going to run out till 10, 15 years ago are still producing. Plus you have smaller oil companies that have spun out of the majors because they're people that worked for the major oil companies for 20, 25 years, and then decided that, basically they'd accrued sufficient expertise to set up their own operation. And when they set up an operation, they do it without the massive overheads of the majors. So consequently, they can actually extract oil from some of the smaller fields, or the fields that are producing at a lesser rate, less natural pressure, than the majors, because they don't carry the overhead. So the notional value, at a conservative estimate in Corrie, is between 10 and 100 billion. Now, that is so ridiculously conservative, it's almost embarrassing for me to give you that number. Because I would estimate that number is at least 10 times that. And here's the owners, here's the partners of Corrie. By the way, how many people here know who owns Topaz gas stations? I've got to tell you, this is incredible to me. I wasn't mentioning this in my presentations because I assumed everybody knew. Until somebody said, sorry, what are you talking about? What's Topaz got to do with this? Topaz is the rebranding of Shell. They rebranded after all the bad press that Shell was getting from its activities up around the northwest. And it decided that rather than run the risk of the Irish people deciding to boycott their gas stations, they would rebrand them as Topaz. And like I said, I assumed everybody knew that. But it is. Topaz is Shell. And they've even put a green light around the tops of their gas stations so it looks like BP. It's unbelievable. They're both as bad as each other. And as we said, Corrie is a sliver. It's a sliver. And when Therese said, nobody really knows what's out there, she's probably right in terms of the great scheme of things. What I can tell you is that there's a lot of speculative seismic that's been done by the exploration companies, and they are sitting on that seismic until somebody comes along and says, we're ready to buy it. And the seismic companies will give little hints that, this seismic survey that they've completed is actually sort of very worthwhile, you're taking an interest in it. So the seismic, the exploration companies, the likes of my former company, Schlumberger, have a pretty damn good idea of what's sitting out there. And it's phenomenal. And that's why these guys needed to get their hands on it. So that, of course, there is less reliance on gas and other hydrocarbons coming in from Russia through Eastern Europe, and anybody actually sort of siphoning off supplies as it comes through to the west. We have Dunquin, this gas field. Obviously the location a bit further offshore, so a little less accessible. But look at the reserves. 25 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Conservative estimate based on existing technology. Over 4 billion barrels of oil, 62 years of supply at current consumption rates. Not yet really tapped into. The oil price today, I think, is $98 a barrel. Okay? We had a price rise, of course, up until July 2008, when the price of oil hit $147 a barrel. Now, when it hit $147 a barrel, at that moment, the total spend of GDP, global GDP, on hydrocarbons was 7%. And what we've seen time and time again is that when the total spend on global hydrocarbons reaches 7% of global GDP, the market crashes.